Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new live stream top-level CERRE debate. I'm Bruno Libabert, the Director General of the Center on Regulation in Europe, CERRE, the independent think tank focusing on the regulation of digital energy mobility and other sectors directly or indirectly related to network industries. You may remember that in the last 2 months, we've had the chance to have with us for similar top-level debates Margrethe Vestager, Thierry Breton, Mark Zuckerberg, and Pascal Lamy. We talked about digital sovereignty and about the conditions for a possible digital deal between tech and government. And this afternoon, we're going to address another topical set of issues under the question global online platforms, 1, 2, or 3 regulatory models. Digital technologies and the online platforms we use every day may be global, but it's, however, less and less the case for their regulation. Around the world, public authorities are looking at how technology is being used, the impact it's having, and the responsibility and liability of tech companies. Even if we see some common features in the responses given, increasing divergences between continents, between countries, or sometimes even between sub-national entities pose the question of the future of digital regulation. To discuss this, I'm once again very lucky to welcome 2 global players for what should be, I think, an inspiring discussion. And I'd like wholeheartedly thank both of them for the swift positive response to the CERRE invitation. Brad Smith is Microsoft president. He's the chief legal officer of Microsoft as well. He joined Microsoft in 1993 as an associate general counsel here in Europe. And Bill Gates said that he very rapidly recognized Brad as, I quote, a sophisticated thinker, unquote. It's a fact that over the years, Brad Smith has initiated a profound cultural and strategic shift within his group. He has, in particular, been leading work on a wide range of issues, including cybersecurity, AI, privacy, environmental sustainability, and many other topics. Brad Smith also authored last year a book which personally I highly recommend reading. It's called Tools and Weapons, the Promise and Perils of the Digital Age. So good morning, Brad. It's great to have you with us, not least because I understand that for you joining from Redmond, Washington, United States, it's 8 a.m.
It is 8 a.m. It's a pleasure to be here. It's the easiest trip I've ever taken to Brussels, but I still miss being there in person, but it's very nice to be with you. Thank you. Okay, great. And I see that on our screen, the
Vêra Jourová is about to join us. A former minister for regional development in the Czech government, Vêra Jourová is the European Commissioner Vice President in charge of values and transparency. And in the previous College of Commissioners, she was in charge of justice, consumers, and gender equality. And in that first mandate, Vêra Jourová launched the General Data Protection Regulation, which is also known as what, in a speech last year, the Commission acutely called my most beloved abbreviation, GDPR. And I understand that to make this debate even timelier, Commissioner, you're going to have tomorrow the Commission to adopt its first full assessment of your baby. So thank you very much for joining, Madam Vice President, even if I see that for the moment, for technical reason, we don't see you yet, but I'm sure that this is just a question of second. We're going to have around a 45-minute conversation, and I'd like to remind viewers that they have the possibility to ask questions via Slido with the code /CERRE-digital. So my first question will be to you, Brad. You represent a global player. So do you see different regulatory models to deal with tech and with online platforms in particular? And I would say that if so, are those models value-based or geography-based? And perhaps to avoid remaining at a too conceptual level for our viewers, how do the difference between the various models translate concretely regarding privacy protection, harmful online contents, AI. Brad, please.
Well, we definitely see different trends in different parts of the world, and I don't think that's a surprise. I think people who are watching this are probably familiar with these trends. The first thing I would point to, even if I were not doing this virtually in Europe today, is the leadership position that the European Union and the European Commission has really taken, not just in recent years, but for a number of decades. And I think that the history of privacy rules and now the GDPR, very much illustrate the values-based approach that Europe has taken. It's an approach that Europe is also comfortable adopting in the form of laws, and increasingly laws that apply across the EU in the form of regulations. The United States, for the last few decades, has typically been more comfortable relying on the market and having fewer laws, but that's starting to change. Although we still don't have a national privacy law in the United States. And it's relatively easy to contrast the more rules-based system that we have in Europe with the more market-based system we have in the United States. I think it's often the case these days that people then point to China as another model. It tends to be a model that, as we all know, involves more state direction of the economy as a whole, sometimes through formal signals like rules, but often through informal signals in terms of what's led by the government. That, I think, creates sort of three broad approaches. What I would point to is, to some degree, something that's even more dynamic than that. I think if we look beyond privacy and we think about digital safety, it's interesting to look just back at the past couple of years. Really, in the wake of the Christchurch terrorist attack a little more than a year and 3 months ago, we saw a new law adopted in Australia. It was a law that imposed much more concrete rules and more specific penalties on companies if they failed to address terrorist and violent extremist content on the internet. And we've seen this spread around the world. We've seen new initiatives take off in Canada. We've seen an initiative in the United Kingdom, in Germany, and France. And I think that is, in fact, a good indication of what we're likely to see throughout this decade, really an accelerating trend where more governments act. They often act at a more common and faster rate of speed, and increasingly they influence each other. I would say, if I were to just then conclude with one general observation, I do continue to see the trends from Brussels being the most influential in the world. Even when you look at something like the Australian law last year that was adopted in Canberra, it was clearly influenced by a lot of thinking that had been taking place for a couple of years in Brussels, and then the Australians built upon it.
Vice President Jourová, thank you. I see that the techniques has saved us eventually. So I would like to ask you, what are the different values? I mean, you are in charge of values. What are the different values of the different sensitivities those models are based upon? And perhaps, first of all, it's good that you remind us, what are those European values which basically are driving regulation?
Well, I thank you very much for having me here, and finally we managed to get back to connect back. What are the values? We want to develop digital sphere for the benefit of the people, but it means that the values which are so dear to us and which are so respected for normal life, for offline life, should be also protected and respected in online world. So the values I speak about is first the freedom and human dignity. I think that nobody should be the subject of, I call it digital lynch, something like attacking the people from online perspective, it's as dangerous as attacking the people from offline perspective. So the respect for the human dignity and its everybody's safety, fairness, openness, responsibility, all these values, equality. We had very good debate with Brad Smith last year about artificial intelligence, how important it is that it doesn't work only for some. And when we look at the development of technologies in the current context of the increased and heated debate about racism, it's very topical that we do not create the new realities, new world, which will import all these insecurities and unfairness from the current world. So these are the values. We have something valuable in the EU, and I think it's also because we have some kind of healthy instinct when it comes to digital. And Brad indicated that the EU seems to be in some aspects forward, that we really want the technologies to serve the people and not vice versa. That's why also I have to mention here GDPR, which is based on the value that my identity is something I cannot sell, and I have to have 100% guarantee that my privacy and my identity will be protected. And we have this basic fix through GDPR, and whatever we do now, for instance, the tracing apps to help the COVID-19 diagnosis. For these new tools, we were well equipped with GDPR. Yeah, we referred to the principles of GDPR, and we were a kind of not relaxed, but more assured that the tracing apps will not go beyond what we want, even in an emergency.
If I take a biblical analogy, I would say, in the beginning, the first words, in the beginning, there was internet, one internet for the world, an internet with global communication siloed where we can reach out everywhere, and with basically one model. Then we thought, and we could see that this was used or misused in some parts of the world, for instance, in an authoritarian way. And at some stage, people opposed a Western model towards an authoritarian model. My question to you, to both of you, is, can we still talk of a Western model today? Are we sharing the same model of regulation in the United States and in Europe? Perhaps Brad first, and then the Vice President.
I do think that there is a Western model. I do think that it's fair to point to that. Yeah, I think that typically when people talk about a Western model in the world today, it's perhaps with an asterisk. It starts with Europe and then a transatlantic alignment of an approach. And in the world today, I think a Western model, in fact, typically then involves many other democracies around the world, including those distributed in what has often been called the Far East, countries like South Korea and Japan, for example. But I do think it is rooted in Western values. I think they are rooted, frankly, in European values. These are the values that Vice President Jourová just talked about. And I would hasten to underscore that, although the implementation of the values may differ, the political process may change. You may see some countries move faster and others move slower. You do see a fundamental alignment in my view. And I think it's good for the 76 democratic nations of the world that we, in particular, advance a transatlantic dialogue and even a common transatlantic approach where we can. Now, interestingly, these days, that typically calls on the United States to follow Europe rather than the other way around, simply because Europe tends to lead. But ultimately, I think the more that we can encourage this common approach, and the more that companies like ours that are based in the United States can encourage the United States government to align with this common approach, I think the better served technology will be, and I think the better served the world will be.
Do you share that? Do you share what Brad Smith said, Vêra Jourová?
Yes, well, I am known as a very strong believer in transatlantic cooperation in many different veins and channels. And as such, after several years working on data protection and digital content, I have behind me maybe hundreds of hours of debates with American partners. And it's interesting picture I happily received. It's a fascinating experience. I spoke to the officials, to the people from the Congress, Jeff Sessions. I spoke to Wilbur Ross and big man of the government. Are there any women, by the way? Oh, this is another topic. But I spoke to the civil society people. I spoke to American media, which not as with journalists, but with opinion makers. It was very interesting. For instance, in New York Times, very interesting debate. And of course, the dominating part of my time spent with the Americans was with the platforms and with the big tech managers. And Brad knows that we had many talks. And I had, with the platforms, I will speak about our discussions with the business. I always had a very strong feeling that we have a common denominator as for the values, which we do not have to explain to each other. Something given. And the words like freedom of speech, freedom as such, access to information, protection of privacy even, didn't need much explanation. And it was very, very relaxing for me because I could kind of rely on the communication, which does not include any bad surprises on principal things. Yeah. So if I can simplify it, I always had a feeling that with the American partners, we are moving within the same circle of values. And I saw this also in Japan, in South Korea, which Brad also mentioned. That's why I see a very good possibility of convergence, a global convergence, at least in the privacy field, with the like-minded countries where we do not have to explain at length to each other why we should protect the privacy of each individual person.
When you look, though, at the panorama of the regulatory playground in the world, you see a difference. In your book, Brad, you write, if we let things fragment so that rules vary hugely from country to country, it won't be good for customers, it won't be good for the tech industry or for society. Can you tell us, how do global tech, how do big tech deal with increasing regulatory fragmentation?
Well, it's a really interesting question, and I think you broadly have two alternative approaches as a company. One is to look for sort of the high watermark. In other words, if there is a regulation that is equal to or greater than anywhere else in the world, and then you apply it, and then you do it on a global basis. And the other alternative is you implement different systems in different parts of the world. There's no doubt, in my view at least, that the second approach is more challenging. It's especially challenging when you're calling on engineers to design different architectural approaches to how the technology should work. Then it typically requires creating different compliance systems, which involve just a multitude of different internal processes, policies, and then people and technical systems to support. Aside from making things more expensive, I just think that it creates more opportunity for mistakes, for errors. So wherever possible, I've always preferred trying to find a singular approach. Now, for us as a company, that actually has not been too difficult to date. So for example, when the GDPR took effect, we were the first company, in fact, I think even to this day, we're one of the few that has said that we'll apply the benefits and the rights of the GDPR to every consumer on the planet, and not just every consumer who lives in the European Union. And we felt very comfortable doing that. I think what it gives to people outside of Europe is the obvious opportunity to benefit from the high watermark created for privacy protection inside Europe. But I do think that it points to the increasing risk of fragmentation as we go forward. And that's why the more there is this kind of dialogue across borders around the world, and ultimately the more there is a global approach, even I'll say something like a global privacy charter that we might look to a decade from now, I think the better served technology will be, and more importantly, the better served the people who rely on technology will be.
We see on both sides of the pond developments which are not likely to lead to a smooth regulatory framework. I'm referring, for instance, for the rise of illiberal democracy in certain EU member states, or some other forms of populism in the US. Is there a risk that internal developments such as those lead to a fragmentation of the regulation of internet, of the platform within those territories? Take for instance, what's happening with Section 230 in the States, the way the DSA is likely to be accepted or challenged, possibly in some quarters of the community. Madame Jourová.
Yes, let me say also a few words whether fragmentation or not. Of course, we do not want fragmentation in the EU. And I think that it's high time to say that the digital development or technologies have very strong integrating impact on the EU. And we would be very unwise if we let happen the creation of different legal rules in different member states. So one continent, one law is where we want to go. And it will be the DSA, the Digital Service Act, which will, I hope, follow this philosophy or this logic of one continent, one law after GDPR, because it's practical, it's comfortable for the businesses, it's very, very good for the people. And that's why we will do our best to have the rules which will be acceptable for all. And speaking about illiberal democracies, yes, we have a problem in the EU, and there might be even stronger call for and demand for strong hands for the governments, which will be very strong and which will, how to say, which the people will allow to decrease the freedoms. I am so unhappy to say that. But we live in a very strange era when populism and nationalism is on the rise, and also the appetite to have stronger position on side of the political how to say, power. And here comes the fantastic feature of internet as something which is open and democratic and available, and something where the freedom of speech and access to information is guaranteed. And that's why I want to say that internet and the platforms can be very important player in the countries where we will see that increased power of the government, decreased power of the media, shrunk space of the civil society, and all these factors which we don't think belong to the healthy democratic system. So we should not only think about how to regulate and whether to regulate and how to minimize the power of big tech or of tech in general, not only big, but we should think about how to enhance and support the positive role, which we see necessary.
Yeah, I would just build on that a bit. I mean, I think it's really interesting because if you just step back and think about the arc of history, there have been two powerful forces over the last 30 years that have been fostering a more integrated and united Europe. One is the European Union, and the other is digital technology. And so it's interesting to have this conversation with the two of us representing each of these. Now, we're obviously at a moment in time, we may be at more than a moment, it's been going on for some years, where we're working through some reaction to this integration. And we are seeing both some pressure to pull back, as well as, I think you put it rightly, the rise of some illiberal political forces. And I think that takes us back to the values. And I think this is a time when, of course, government, and starting with the European Commission and the European Parliament and all the EU institutions, need to be the principal voice in Europe for the values that gave rise to it. But I also think it's incumbent upon us as the creators of this digital technology to be voices for democratic values as well. And whether it's the kind of defending democracy program that we at Microsoft have put in place, that you see in a number of other tech companies, whether it's the decisions that we make, for example, when we'll stand up and seek new laws or go to court to stand up for the rights of people, as we've done as a company multiple times in the United States around privacy. Or just last week, Microsoft was the one company that was a direct party in the United States Supreme Court decision that upheld the rights of dreamers, immigrants. I think these values are being tested, and that happens from time to time. And when the tests come, we have to stand up and pass them.
Let's come back to Europe. And we see that thanks to a mix of factors, including, among others, a large market, a political will to aim at high regulatory standards and a strong regulatory capacity to do so, the EU has managed, and you said so, you reminded us, Vice President, the EU has managed to assert its regulatory model beyond the frontiers of the Union, what my colleague Anu Bradford, the US-Finnish scholar, has called the Brussels effect, because there's been a Brussels effect with the GDPR, there's been a Brussels effect in antitrust when the EU Commission can block a merger between two American companies, GE Honeywell, there's a Brussels effect in environmental law, etc. So could current developments in Europe, such as Brexit, such as liberal democracy, we just talked, such as difficulties to get some strong solidarity between member states in their reaction following the COVID-19 pandemics, could those developments prevent the Union to continue asserting its standards abroad? Mm-hmm. Vice President.
Yes, I know it's a question for me. Well, the EU is a big survivor. And just look at the last 5 years. I didn't expect when I started in the Commission in 2014 that it will be a permanent crisis management. And not only creating the legislation and lengthy legislative process, also operational decision-making and big political choices. Just look at it. Ukrainian crisis, migration, terrorist attacks, Brexit. Then also, let's be honest, also the change in Washington in the White House was a kind of shock for the EU, and many other things. And we managed to not only to survive, but to make European Union stronger, at least in terms of economy. And this is exactly what we plan to do now. Without solidarity and without joining forces, we will one day get out of this COVID crisis, but it will take longer and it will be more expensive. That's why we are taking practical steps now to collect the money, to send the money as soon as possible where it's heavily needed, to update the legislation so that to be more resilient vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Also here we have to mention China, where we have to react on the changed position of China, or changed, how to say, a global strategy of China, which is quite obvious. So yeah, I think that the EU is going the same direction as for the values. Coming back to digital sphere, whatever we do and will do in the regulatory field vis-a-vis digital, the values will be first. So you can expect from us a human-centric approach, be it AI or be it platforms, but we will not come with any surprises which should appear out of the blue, because whatever we will do in terms of our regulatory work, it will be always after very open and thorough debate, also with the businesses. And Brad knows that this is the way we are doing things, and with the member states, because we will need to reconfirm with the member states that they respect the role of the EU to come with the rules for the digital sphere, that it should not be the national endeavor, that it's for the EU.
Brad, what's your view from, I would say, from the receiving end of the European efforts? Do you see from the outside that what's taking place in Europe could weaken the impact that our standards could have abroad?
Actually, mostly I would agree with Vice President Jourová. You know, it's always easy to look at a situation and see all of the causes of concern. But I think from a broad perspective, when you look around the world, you continue to see more positive momentum in Brussels than any major capital in the world. And you see it in the new initiatives of this new commission, and the kinds of proposals that are being discussed now. If you look at, for example, at the white paper on artificial intelligence, I think that the commission is staking out a leadership role on bringing values to artificial intelligence. And if you look at the discussion around something like the Digital Services Act, you see similar trends, both focusing on sort of challenges around, I'll say, digital safety, but also the future of competition law. So at a time where it is just frankly more of a challenge in many democratic capitals around the world to muster a consensus, you do see more ongoing forward momentum in Brussels. So I actually look at the 2020s, and I would say they're at least starting out with the EU continuing to play not just a global leadership role, but I would almost say an intellectual leadership role. And I think that does go to your point, the Brussels effect. I mean, I think that's part of what that book captured. It is that intellectual leadership that has rippled around the world, and I don't see that abating.
I would like to ask you, because we're coming close to the end of this conversation. I'd like to ask you, Brad, that you said in your book that for almost a decade from 2002, your job was to hammer out the equivalent of peace treaties with governments. And I'd like to ask you, is this still on the agenda? And perhaps more broadly, what do you expect from governments today, a global company such as Microsoft, what do you expect from governments, and not only from the European Union, but more broadly?
Well, I would say a few things. I mean, first, I think, we of course love technology. That's why, those of us who work in the tech sector do so. But I personally think it's important to say that democracy is more important than technology. It was here before our products were invented, and I think it needs to be here after our products are replaced by something in the future that will succeed them. I do think that the preservation of all of the values we're talking about today really need to remain a principal priority. The second thing I would say is, we actually welcome it when governments move faster, when they iterate, when they innovate, and when they have the kinds of dialogue with the tech sector that we do see taking place, through things like a white paper and our ability to comment and provide input to them. I do think that there will be some very important opportunities and challenges in this decade for Europe and technology. And I would really just conclude by pointing to two. One is something we haven't talked about, but I just think will just be the issue of the decade, even though it's not the issue of the year. And that's the importance of sustainability and what a green recovery will look like, and how digital technology can be harnessed to advance that, and the responsibility of technology participants to take our steps to advance what are frankly the needs of the entire planet. And I do think the second issue that we haven't touched directly upon, but I just think remains of paramount importance is frankly what's now being termed digital sovereignty. As I study this, across Europe and really around the world, I think it's right that governments protect and advance their own digital sovereignty. But you probably won't be surprised to hear me say that I hope it will be done in a way that will make room for others from other parts of the world as well, pursuant to objective rules and requirements. When I study the initiatives around digital sovereignty, I fundamentally see them addressing three goals. One is the protection of personal privacy. A second is the preservation of national security. And a third is the advancement of local economic opportunity. And I think as a global technology player, participant, it's important for us as a company to advance all three of those, frankly, in order to do right by the marketplace and the needs of people in Europe. But what we need is a broad approach so that digital sovereignty doesn't become digital protectionism, but instead a rules-based approach, as we've seen in GDPR, that preserves and advances European values while also making room for innovation and economic participation by others.
Thank you. Vice President Jourová, you will have the final word. What do you expect from the global technology industry today? What kind of societal contribution, among others?
Oh, well, first, I want to react also on this sovereignty, which is partly the answer on your question. What I expect a balanced approach. And we had a very big debate, and not only one, on what is the digital sovereignty. For me, sovereignty is the self-confidence to remain open. Yeah, so this is also projected in GDPR and in many other things. And what I expect, of course, the partners from the big tech world know that I always ask them, how will you improve the world which you have spoiled? And they always take it as a kind of cynical joke, but we have to join forces and to really find all the possibilities to minimize the negative effects and to push forward all the positive things and the benefits which the people can enjoy globally. Because I don't believe that there should be differences in how internet should serve the people. We should somehow work in the direction of coherence and common approach. And the last word, I will quote Brad Smith, not Brad Pitt, Brad Smith, and again his book. It was Freud. No, Brad, I like the quote from your book that we need to reconcile an era of rapid technological change with traditional and even timeless values. And it brings us back to the beginning, because you asked me what should be changed. The values should be preserved and the technology should help. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice President. Thank you to both of you. We've received a number of questions, but unfortunately, due to time constraints, I'm afraid we now have to conclude this very interesting conversation. For my part, I'd say that this debate provides another illustration of the inescapable need for the tech sector and governments to work together and with the civil society if they are to successfully address the respective challenges, including a lack of trust that each party is facing. And I'd say that meeting these challenges requires from tech companies the concrete demonstration that they're ready to live up to their social and societal responsibility. And at the time when technology, its use, its misuse can be so disruptive for our democracies, I think this is essential if big tech wants to thrive and remain sustainable. And I think that's what we've heard this afternoon from Brad Smith. And from governments and regulators, I think that citizens expect to benefit from a legal framework securing access for all of them to quality, competitive digital services that guarantee their safety, their security, uphold their democratic rights, and empower them economically and socially, of course. But such legislation and regulation must at the same time be sufficiently adaptive to fit ongoing technological developments, and I think it should also be conducive to sustainable, innovative investment. What I want to tell you to conclude is that we at CERRE, we will definitely continue to investigate the many complex dimensions and implications of internet regulation, online platform regulation. We will also continue to provide independent fact-based analysis, policy recommendations on how to address those. So once again, I would like to thank very much our two guests, Vice President Vêra Jourová and President Brad Smith for their participation. Thanks a lot also to the great CERRE team, and in particular to Lauriane Gillet, who helped me to prepare this and made this possible. The video of this live will be available on CERRE's YouTube channel shortly. We have scheduled at least 2 other top-level live stream debates in the coming months. And I can already tell you that one of them will be dealing with the role of telecom infrastructure in Europe's recovery. So you'll hear about us soon, to be kept informed about these debates and also about our other forthcoming activities. Just visit cerre.eu and register to our newsletter. Bye-bye, stay safe, hope to see you again very soon. Bye now.
Very much, bye-bye.
Bye.